Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we plunge into the heart of 17th century London, where the flickering candlelight of Whitehall Palace casts long shadows, illuminating a scene of desperate and bizarre medical theatre. You're there, standing on the fringes of the royal bedchamber, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and strange herbal concoctions. The king, Charles II, lies sprawled, his body convulsing, his eyes rolled back in their sockets. A frantic energy fills the room as a dozen of the finest minds in medicine, or so they believe, swarm around him, their hands a blur of motion, their faces a mask of grim determination. They are trying to save him, but they are also, in their own misguided way, killing him. You probably won't survive this journey with your modern sensibilities intact, so prepare for a reality check on the strange and often terrifying history of medicine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And go ahead, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is for you. I love seeing where our little community stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The clock on the mantelpiece, a gift from some continental ambassador, its chimes a delicate, unheeded whisper, reads just past 8 in the morning on February 2nd, 1685. You watch as a valet, a blur of nervous energy, tugs at the king's curtains, hoping to stir him from his slumber. It's a standard morning ritual, one performed countless times before, but today the silence is wrong. The valet leans in, a hand reaching for the king's shoulder, and that's when it happens. A low groan, a gurgle from deep in the king's throat, and then his entire body seizes, a puppet on a string pulled by an invisible, cruel hand. You hear the valet's yelp, a sound swallowed by the growing commotion. The doctors are summoned, a veritable army of them, their periwigs askew as they rush to the scene. The Grand Physician, Dr. Thomas Willis, a man whose name will one day be synonymous with the circle of blood vessels at the base of the brain, is among them. He's a pioneer, a man of science, but even he is a product of his time. His mind is a swirling vortex of ancient Greek humours, newfangled chemical theories, and a generous dose of guesswork. You watch as the bedchamber becomes a stage for a macabre play. The first act is immediate, a frantic attempt to bleed the king. They believe the fit is caused by a build-up of bad blood, an excess of one of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. A barber surgeon, his sleeves rolled up, deftly slices into the king's arm. You wince as a thick, dark stream of blood spills into a silver basin. The king, weakened and barely conscious, doesn't even flinch. But the bleeding isn't enough. They need to purge him of the foul humours they believe are poisoning his system. A strong emetic is administered, a potion designed to induce vomiting. It's a bitter, foul-smelling liquid that you can practically taste in the air. The king's body lurches, but nothing comes up. The doctors, undeterred, move on to the next play in their arsenal, a concoction of herbs and chemicals, a powerful purgative designed to flush the king's bowels. Historians still argue whether these treatments were a genuine attempt to save the king or a form of medical torture. It's a legitimate question when you consider the sheer brutality of their methods. The minutes stretch into an hour, and then another. The king is fading, his breath comes in ragged gasps. Dr. Willis, ever the innovator, orders a paste of spirit of hartshorn applied to the king's temples. It's a remedy made from ammonia distilled from deer antlers, a popular if pungent stimulant of the time. The smell is sharp, acrid, like a cleaning fluid mixed with something wild and organic. You can feel the sting of it just by being in the same room, but still, the king's condition deteriorates. The doctors, now in a state of barely contained panic, turn to their most powerful and strange remedies. One physician, a grim-faced man with a neatly trimmed beard, holds a small vial. Inside is something that looks like powdered dirt. It's pulvis humani crani, a powder made from a human skull. It's a macabre but surprisingly common remedy in 17th century Europe, believed to be effective against a variety of ailments, including epilepsy, which some doctors now suspect the king is suffering from. You stand there, a silent observer, as the king's final hours become a blur of desperate acts. They cup him, they bleed him, they make him swallow bizarre concoctions, all in the name of a medical science that, by our standards, is more superstition than fact. A royal physician, his brow furrowed in concentration, forces a final potion down the king's throat, a mixture of crushed pearl, amber, and other precious stones. It's a last desperate gamble, a sign of their utter confusion and helplessness. They're throwing everything they have at the problem, hoping something, anything, will stick. It's a bizarre, almost comical scene if you can manage to distance yourself from the sheer tragedy of it all. It's like a medieval alchemist and a modern-day snake oil salesman had a baby, and that baby became a royal physician. And all the while, outside the window, the city of London wakes up, oblivious to the strange and terrible drama unfolding within the palace walls. The sun rises, painting the sky with a gentle pale light that seems completely out of place with the frantic dark chaos in the king's chamber. The king's body, once so full of life and a famously good appetite, is now just a vessel for this medical battle. He is fading fast. You hear whispers from the courtiers huddled in the antechamber, their voices hushed and full of dread. They talk of poison, of plots, of a sudden unnatural illness. The doctors, meanwhile, are focused on the physical, on the humours and the vapours, on the balance of the body. They don't yet know that their patient is about to die, a fact that will send shockwaves through the entire kingdom. The next few hours will be a whirlwind of political intrigue and medical post-mortem, but for now you are stuck in this room, watching a man be bled, purged, and powdered with human bone, all in a vain attempt to save him. The irony of it all is almost too much to bear. It's a mainstream historical fact that Charles II's death was a spectacle of 17th century medicine. But a quirky tidbit. The use of pulverised human skull was actually considered a high-end, even fashionable remedy. It's a reminder that what we consider normal is very much a product of our time, and as the king's eyes flutter open one last time, a moment of lucidity in the storm, he whispers a final poignant apology to his courtiers, asking them to forgive him for being an unconscionable time a-dying. And then he is gone. The moment the king's final breath escapes his lips, the frantic energy in the room doesn't dissipate, it simply changes. The frenzied movements of the doctors become slower, more deliberate, their faces shifting from masks of frantic hope to grim resignation. They are no longer fighting for a life, they are now facing a post-mortem, a medical inquest that will define their careers and perhaps their very survival. You watch as Doctor. Willis and his colleagues exchange knowing glances. The failure is public, a stinging indictment of their methods. But the king's death also presents a unique opportunity for them to explore the very mysteries they believe govern the human body. The prevailing belief, remember, is that disease isn't caused by germs or viruses, but by an imbalance of those four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They see the body as a complex machine, sure, but one powered by these invisible spiritual fluids. You can practically feel their minds whirring, trying to rationalise the king's sudden collapse through this lens. Was it an excess of hot choleric bile that sent his body into convulsions? Or perhaps a sudden, melancholic rush of black bile, thickening his blood and choking his vital organs? They don't have the luxury of our modern understanding of seizures or heart attacks. To them, the brain isn't a collection of neurons firing electrical signals. It's the seat of the soul, a spongy organ that dictates temperament and character, and is easily disturbed by an influx of humours. So, when they look at the king's now still body, they see a puzzle box, a biological mystery waiting to be solved with their ancient tools and theories. They're about to embark on an autopsy, not just to determine the cause of death for the historical record, but to prove their own theories correct. It's a medical maelstrom, a hurricane of the mind, and you are right there in the eye of the storm. The doctors huddle together, their whispers barely audible over the soft weeping of the ladies in waiting. They are discussing the post-mortem examination. It is a necessary, if gruesome, tradition. A monarch's death is a matter of state, and the cause must be officially recorded. But there's more to it than just that. The suddenness of Charles's death has fueled whispers of foul play, of poison, and if the doctors can find evidence of a natural cause, a humoral imbalance, a flaw in the organs, they can put these rumours to rest and save their own reputations. It's a delicate dance between science, politics, and self-preservation. One of the physicians, a slightly younger man with a nervous twitch in his eye, speaks in a low tone. He mentions the king's spleen, a crucial organ in their humoral theory. They believed it was the seat of melancholy, of black bile. If they could find an enlargement or some other abnormality, It would be a perfect explanation for the king's fits and collapse. It's a quirky tidbit of medical history, this obsession with the spleen as a source of sadness. The very word splenetic, to mean bad-tempered or irritable, comes from this very belief. You observe as they begin their preparations. The room is cleared of all but the most trusted servants, and of course the physicians. The body is moved from the bed to a large table. The pale morning light streams through the windows, illuminating the scene with a cold, almost clinical glare. You notice the king's hands, so recently full of life and gesturing with characteristic wit, now lie still, his fingers slightly curled. The physicians prepare their instruments, knives, saws and probes, all gleaming in the light. They will begin the dissection, a process that is both a scientific inquiry and a morbid spectacle. A mainstream historical fact is that autopsies, though not as common as they would become, were a recognised medical procedure for prominent figures. This was especially true when the cause of death was sudden or suspicious. But the way they approached it, the lens through which they saw the body, was so utterly different from our own. They weren't looking for a cardiac arrest or an aneurysm. They were looking for a physical manifestation of a spiritual imbalance. They believed they could literally see the humours at work, in the colour of the blood, the texture of the organs. As the first incision is made, you instinctively recoil, but you force yourself to watch. They are opening the king's body to prove their theories, to calm a nation's fears, and to save their own necks. It's a fascinating, if gruesome, moment in history. The smell of the chamber, already stuffy, now has a new coppery undertone. The physicians are methodical, their movements precise. They are not acting out of malice, but out of a deeply ingrained belief system. They truly believe they are practicing the highest form of medicine, even as you, with your modern knowledge, know their methods are based on a profound misunderstanding of human physiology. It's a reminder of how slippery the concept of truth can be. What is absolute fact to them is a quaint, almost laughable historical footnote to us. And this is a time when the very act of dissecting a human body was still fraught with social and religious anxieties, making their task all the more significant. Historians still argue whether the physicians were truly trying to find the truth, or simply trying to craft a palatable narrative for the public and the new king, James II, who was known to be a man of swift and often brutal judgment. One of the physicians, Dr. Scarborough, a man whose reputation for anatomical knowledge is second to none, leans over the king's chest, his face a mask of concentration. He begins to describe what he sees, dictating his observations to a scribe. The words he uses are of his time, full of references to humours and their supposed effects. He talks of the noble parts and the viscera. You hear him mention the heart, the lungs, the liver and the stomach. A checklist of organs they plan to examine with the utmost care. This is not just a scientific exercise, it is a ritual. Every part of the king's body holds significance, and every observation they make will be scrutinised by the court and, eventually, by history itself. The atmosphere is tense, thick with the weight of expectation. They are looking for a sign, a physical flaw that will explain everything. And what they find, or what they choose to report that they find, will shape the narrative of Charles II's death for centuries to come. The scene is almost eerily quiet, save for the occasional soft scrape of a knife or the scratching of the scribe's quill. The doctors are in their element, a bizarre blend of surgical precision and philosophical speculation. They talk of the heat and cold of the organs, the dryness or moisture. It sounds like they are discussing a wine tasting, not a post-mortem. It's a great example of the language of science changing over time, and it's a testament to the fact that even when people have the best intentions, they can still be profoundly wrong. Remember the pulverized human skull from the last section? They believed that was a legitimate treatment. Now they are performing an autopsy based on a theory of medicine that is, to us, completely discredited. You can't help but feel a little sorry for them. They are so earnest, so dedicated, and yet they are stumbling around in the dark. It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes you have to try everything before you find what actually works. With the incision made and the internal organs now exposed, the morbid symphony of the autopsy begins in earnest. You watch from the periphery, a ghost in the royal chamber, as the physicians get down to the truly bizarre business of 17th century forensics. They are methodical, their movements precise, but the remedies they used in the king's final hours are still fresh in your mind. Remember the crushed pearl and the powdered human skull? Now, you get to see how a belief in these outlandish treatments is reflected in their post-mortem analysis. They aren't looking for a cardiac arrest. They're looking for signs that the humours were out of balance, a belief system so deeply ingrained that it influences every observation they make. They begin with the organs of the chest and abdomen, a tour of the king's inner sanctum. The air is heavy with the coppery scent of blood and a faint, sweetish odour of decay. The first organ to be examined is the stomach. You lean in, trying to see what the doctors see. It's a key piece of the puzzle for them, as they believe the stomach is a crucible of digestion, a place where humours can either be balanced or thrown into chaos. A mainstream historical fact is that the king had a famously voracious appetite, a love of rich and decadent food that was well known throughout the court. He was also a man who enjoyed his wine. The physicians, with their rudimentary understanding of digestion, were convinced that his lifestyle must have played a role in his demise. One of them, a man with thin, serious lips, begins to describe the state of the stomach, dictating his observations to the waiting scribe. He mentions the stomach lining, its texture and colour, and makes a note of its contents. This is where the story gets a little strange. The king's final meal was, by all accounts, a feast, and the physicians are looking for any evidence of something indigestible, something that might have putrefied and caused a build-up of noxious humours. It's a quirky tidbit of this particular autopsy that the doctors spent an inordinate amount of time examining the food residue in the king's stomach. They believed that certain foods could produce specific humours. For instance, red meat was thought to produce hot, sanguine humours, while fish was considered cold and phlegmatic. This isn't just a scientific inquiry, it's an ideological one. They want to find something in the king's last meal that confirms their pre-existing beliefs about the cause of death. They are essentially reverse engineering a diagnosis. One physician points out a small lump of what appears to be undigested meat, and you can practically hear the aha moment in his voice. He describes it as a crudity, a term they used for undigested food that was believed to ferment and produce foul vapours. These vapours, they theorised, would then rise to the brain, causing the convulsions and eventual collapse. It sounds absurd to us, but to them, this was a perfectly logical and scientific explanation. The doctors then turn their attention to the king's final medications. Remember the pulvis humani crani, the powdered human skull? It was a potent drug for them. They believed it to be a powerful anticonvulsant, a kind of primitive Valium. A doctor carefully sifts through the stomach contents, looking for any trace of the strange substances he and his colleagues had administered. He's checking, not for a mistake, but for evidence that the medication had worked, or at least had been properly digested. It's a kind of self-justification, a way to assure themselves that they did everything right. Another doctor points out a small greenish stain in the stomach lining. He speculates that it might be a remnant of the spirit of hartshorn they had applied to the king's temples and forced him to ingest. They believed it was a powerful stimulant, designed to jolt the king back to consciousness. They are interpreting every colour, every texture, every little detail through the prism of their own medical practices. It's a fascinating peek into the confirmation bias of the past. But not everything is so easily explained. One of the physicians, a slightly more pragmatic man named Sir Charles Scarborough, a well-regarded anatomist, raises a quiet question. He notes that the stomach lining, despite the greenish stain, appears to be in relatively good condition, with no major signs of inflammation or corrosion. This is a crucial detail, one that runs counter to the poisoning theories that are already beginning to circulate. If the king had been given a strong poison, the stomach would have been one of the first organs to show the effects, but it doesn't. Or at least the doctors don't see anything that, to them, looks like a powerful poison. This is a moment of doubt, a small crack in the humoral theory that they so fervently believe in. It's a small victory for reality over superstition, a detail that will be mostly ignored in the official report, but one that is important to you as a silent witness. As the doctors continue their examination, you feel a sense of unease. They are so confident, so sure of their methods, and yet they are completely wrong. They are looking for a mythical imbalance, a phantasmagorical build-up of vapours, when the real cause of death, whatever it may be, is right there in front of them, hidden in plain sight. They talk in hushed tones about the state of the stomach's digestion, the quantity of undigested food, and the quality of the chyme, a slurry of digested food. It's a language full of specialised terms, a kind of medical jargon that gives their pronouncements a veneer of scientific authority. But you, with your modern perspective, can see the gaping holes in their logic. They are building a beautiful, complex house of cards, and they are about to present it as the final definitive truth. Historians still argue whether the physicians were genuinely misled by their own theories, or if they were subtly massaging their findings to fit a preconceived narrative, one that would absolve them of any blame for the king's death. This is one of the great open questions of this royal post-mortem. The examination of the stomach concludes, and the scribe's quill scratches out the final words of the section. The physicians move on to the next organ, the liver, a much larger and more complex organ in their humoral framework. They believed the liver was the source of blood, and by extension, the source of life itself. The stage is set for the next scene in this medical drama, a scene that will be just as full of strange beliefs and bizarre observations as the one you've just witnessed. The king's body, now a landscape of opened organs and dissected parts, is the silent witness to all of this. His final meal, his strange medications, and the very theories that guided his doctors, they're all laid bare for you to see, and you realise that the real story of what they found inside Charles II's body isn't just a list of organs and ailments, but a story about the limitations of knowledge and the power of belief. With the stomach's dubious secrets laid bare, the physician's attention shifts, a grim procession moving through the king's opened abdomen. Their next focus is the liver, a large dark organ that, to the 17th century medical mind, was not merely a filter but a powerful factory of life itself. You watch as Dr. Willis and his colleagues turn their gaze to this vital organ, its maroon surface now visible and ready for inspection. In their humoral theory, the liver was the primary source of blood, the very life force that animated the body. Any abnormality in the liver could therefore explain a host of ailments, from fevers to melancholic fits. The pressure in the room ratchets up another notch. They know that what they find here could either confirm their theories or, more dangerously, send them scrambling for a new explanation. A mainstream historical fact is that Charles II was not a man of temperance. His love for rich food, copious amounts of alcohol, and a famously libertine lifestyle was well documented. You've already seen the evidence of his last meal. Now, the doctors are hoping the liver will tell a story that aligns with this historical narrative. They lean in, their faces serious, as one of them, a man with a thick calloused hand, gently probes the organ. He is looking for any sign of hardness or discoloration, anything that might suggest a build-up of bad blood or an excess of yellow bile. In their worldview, a person's temperament, whether they were sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic or melancholic, was directly tied to the state of their liver and the quality of the blood it produced. So, a king with a notoriously passionate and often volatile temperament like Charles's would, in their minds, have a liver that reflected that. The physician dictates his findings to the scribe. He describes the liver as being somewhat enlarged and of a darker colour than normal. This is an important detail, one that he emphasises with a quick glance at his colleagues. To them, a darker than normal liver suggests a build-up of black bile, the humour associated with melancholy and a sluggish, depressive state. This might seem contradictory to the king's last violent convulsions, but in their world the body was constantly in a state of flux. They could argue that the king's final fits were a desperate attempt by the body to rid itself of this excess, to purge the built-up melancholy. It's a perfect, neat little theory, one that aligns with their pre-existing beliefs, and a narrative that will be easy to sell to a court already searching for answers. It's a textbook example of a quirky tidbit of medical history, the belief that the physical appearance of an organ could be a direct window into a person's personality and emotional state. But there is a fly in the ointment. Dr. Scarborough, the anatomist you remember from before, is a quiet but persistent voice of reason. He points out that while the liver is indeed dark, it doesn't show the advanced signs of disease that would be expected from a lifetime of such indulgence. The texture is firm, but not excessively so. There is no visible evidence of advanced cirrhosis, a condition we would now associate with heavy drinking and a rich diet. He's not saying the liver is perfect, but he's not seeing the dramatic, life-ending failure that his colleagues seem to be looking for. It's a small note of dissent, but it's a crucial one. It suggests that while the king's lifestyle was certainly not a healthy one, it may not have been the direct cause of his sudden violent death. Historians still argue whether Scarborough's comments were a genuine medical observation or a subtle political manoeuvre to distance himself from the more outlandish claims of his colleagues. who might have been feeling pressure to provide a definitive humoral-based diagnosis. The examination continues with the other viscera. The spleen, that organ they believed was the seat of melancholy, is also examined. It too is found to be of a reasonable size, a term that is both vague and, in this context, reassuring. It doesn't provide the dramatic spleen-based explanation that some had hoped for. The kidneys are also inspected. This is where the accounts of the autopsy get a little hazy and contradictory, a sign of the chaotic nature of the event. Some later accounts suggest the kidneys showed signs of damage, while others were more vague. It's almost as if the physicians were seeing what they wanted to see, their observations coloured by their need for a diagnosis. They're like a group of art critics looking at a painting, each one seeing a different meaning and a different intent, all based on their own biases. It's a fascinating and at times frustrating window into the subjective nature of what was considered scientific observation at the time. As the doctors finish their inspection of the abdominal cavity, the scribe diligently writes down their findings. They've found a slightly enlarged, darker than normal liver. They've noted a crudity in the stomach. They've ruled out any major obvious signs of poisoning that would have been immediately apparent to them, such as severe corrosion or massive organ failure. But they've also not found a single, definitive cause of death. Their findings are a collection of small observations that, when taken together, can be spun to support their pre-existing humoral theories. They can argue that the king's fits were caused by a build-up of black bile, originating in the slightly enlarged liver and exacerbated by the undigested food in his stomach. It's a beautifully crafted, if completely wrong, narrative, and it serves its purpose perfectly. It provides a natural explanation for the king's death, one that deflects any blame from their own failed treatments and soothes the public's growing fears of a political assassination. The king's body, now a tableau of medical inquiry, is once again moved, this time for the most sensitive and important part of the examination, the opening of the skull. This is the moment of truth, the climax of their medical drama. They believe the brain, the seat of the soul, and the director of the body's movements must hold the key to the king's violent convulsions. The air in the room thickens with anticipation. The physicians exchange a final round of nervous glances. They are about to open the mind of a king, a sacred and forbidden act, and they are hoping that what they find will finally, definitively explain everything. And as you watch them prepare their tools for the final gruesome act, you realise that the story of Charles II's autopsy is not a simple tale of what was found, but a complex tapestry of belief, politics, and the limitations of human knowledge. It is a story of men desperately trying to make sense of the incomprehensible, using the only tools they have, no matter how flawed they may be. Having completed their tour of the king's abdominal and thoracic cavities, the physicians now turn their attention to a part of the autopsy that is as politically charged as it is medically significant, the examination of the kidneys. You watch as the scribe's quill pauses, waiting for the next pronouncement. The kidneys, in the 17th century medical mindset, were not just filters. They were also considered to be intricately linked to a person's vitality, and even their passions. An issue with the kidneys could be a sign of a deeper corruption in the body, a failing of the life force itself. And in the case of a king, a man with a famously active social and romantic life, the condition of these organs was a matter of particular intrigue. The accounts of what was found inside Charles II's body begin to diverge most dramatically here, a telltale sign of the chaos and conflicting agendas at play. A mainstream historical fact is that gout, a painful form of arthritis linked to high levels of uric acid, was a common ailment among the wealthy and a well-known affliction of Charles II himself. Gout is a disease of excess, often brought on by a rich diet and an abundance of alcohol, and it directly involves the kidneys in the body's attempt to process and excrete the uric acid. You might think, therefore, that the physicians would immediately connect any kidney damage to the king's gout. But it's not that simple. One of the doctors, a man named Dr. Richard Lower, a celebrated anatomist and a pioneer in blood transfusion, a quirky tidbit of his biography, begins the examination of the kidneys. He holds one in his hand, his expression unreadable. He dictates to the scribe that the kidneys appear to be in a reasonable state, a phrase that is vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways. He notes some small, darkish spots, but he does not describe them as being a major pathology. This is the official, publicly released version of events. It's a convenient finding, one that suggests the king's kidneys were not the primary cause of his death, and by extension, that his lifestyle was not to blame. It's a narrative that would have been pleasing to the new king, James II, who would want to project an image of continuity and stability, not one of a dissolute predecessor. But then there's the other side of the story, the one whispered in the corridors and recorded in more private, less official accounts. Another physician, a Dr. Walter Charlton, is said to have made a far more damning observation. He reportedly noted that the kidneys were filled with small gritty stones, and that they showed signs of advanced deterioration, a condition we would now call kidney disease, or more specifically, gout-related nephropathy. He is said to have argued that the king's fits were not from a humoral imbalance, but were uremic convulsions, a result of the kidneys failing to filter toxins from the blood. This theory, had it been widely accepted and publicly reported, would have been a scandal. It would have painted a picture of a king brought low by his own excesses, his body unable to cope with his lavish lifestyle. You can feel the tension in the room as these two competing narratives unfold. Dr. Lower, the official voice, is describing one thing, while the unspoken observations of Dr. Charlton and others suggest something entirely different. It's a powerful lesson in the subjectivity of historical records. What gets written down and what gets left out often depends on who is holding the pen and what their agenda is. Historians still argue whether the official account of the kidney's condition was a genuine medical finding or a carefully curated piece of propaganda designed to protect the monarchy's image and the physicians' reputations. It's a debate that goes right to the heart of this historical moment. The lack of a consensus on the kidney's condition is a glaring hole in the official report, one that leaves a space for all kinds of speculation and gossip. You can almost hear the whispers that would have run through the court. They say his kidneys were full of stones. And no, the doctor said they were fine. It's a prime example of how history can be shaped by ambiguity. If the doctors had been definitive in their findings, one way or the other, it would have closed the door on many of these theories. But because they were not, the legend of Charles II's failing kidneys lives on, a testament to the secret life of a king and the internal battles that raged within his own body. The physicians conclude their examination of the abdominal organs, and the focus of their investigation now turns to the most important part of the entire autopsy, the brain. They have looked at the king's last meal, his liver and his kidneys, all of which provided them with convenient, if not entirely convincing, explanations for his death. But the fits, the convulsions, the sudden loss of consciousness, these were all things that in their minds originated in the brain. They believed it was the seat of reason, the director of all bodily functions. Any disturbance there would have been catastrophic, and now, as they prepare to open the skull of a monarch, they are about to perform an act of both scientific inquiry and symbolic transgression. You watch as the room is made ready for this final, gruesome step. The scribe straightens his paper, the other doctors stand at attention, and Dr. Willis, the great physician whose name is associated with the brain, prepares his tools. This is his moment, his chance to prove his theories right, and to find the one definitive cause of death that will put all the rumours to rest. He is not just looking for a physical abnormality, he is looking for a conceptual one. He is looking for a way to explain the king's death in terms of his own revolutionary, but still fundamentally flawed, theories about the mind and the body. And as they begin to make the first cuts into the king's scalp, you can't help but wonder if what they are about to find will be the truth, or just another convenient narrative. The quiet, respectful silence in the room is shattered by the soft rasp of the saw as it begins to cut through the king's skull. It's a chilling sound, a physical act that brings home the finality of it all. This is no longer a king, a symbol of a nation. This is a body, a biological puzzle waiting to be solved, and the answers, whatever they may be, will be forever stained by the political and medical biases of the men who found them. The kidneys in the end were just a prelude. The real drama, the final act of this medical theatre, is about to begin. The low rhythmic scrape of the saw against the king's skull is the only sound in the room. It's a chilling, visceral noise that echoes the finality of the act. You watch as Dr. Willis, the renowned physician, directs the operation. He is in his element, a man who has made a name for himself studying the very organ he is now preparing to open. To him, the brain is the ultimate frontier, the command centre of the body, and the most likely source of the king's violent seizures and sudden demise. He has a theory, a belief that an unseen ailment within the king's skull holds the key to the entire mystery. The other physicians, their faces drawn and serious, watch him with a mixture of respect and anticipation. This is the moment of truth. Once the circular section of bone is carefully removed, exposing the delicate, convoluted surface of the brain, a new wave of tension sweeps through the room. You can almost feel the collective breath being held. Dr. Willis leans in, his face mere inches from the king's grey matter, and he begins his examination. He's looking for anything out of the ordinary: discoloration, swelling, a build-up of fluid. A mainstream historical fact is that in the 17th century, the understanding of the brain was still in its infancy. They knew it was important, but they didn't understand its electrical nature or the specific functions of its different lobes. They believed the brain was a kind of sponge, a soft, delicate organ that could be easily corrupted by the humours or by noxious vapours rising from the stomach. Willis, however, was a step ahead of his time. He was a pioneer of neuroanatomy and had already made significant discoveries about the brain structure, including the Circle of Willis, a network of arteries that he had described years earlier. He was looking for something more than just a vague humoral imbalance. He was looking for a physical cause, a tangible explanation. You watch him gently probe the surface of the brain, his fingers moving with a delicate precision that belies the gruesome nature of his work. He dictates his observations to the scribe, his voice a low, steady murmur. He notes the texture, the colour, and the density of the brain tissue. For a long moment, there is nothing. It appears to be a normal, healthy brain, a finding that would be both a relief and a profound disappointment. But then, Willis's fingers still. He has found something. He directs the scribe to write down his observations, and his voice takes on a new, more serious tone. He points to a small area at the base of the brain, a region that is slightly discoloured and, to his eye, appears to be a bit firmer than the surrounding tissue. He describes a small extravasation of blood, a term that to him meant a hemorrhage. He believes he has found the source of the king's seizures, a bleed in the brain that would have thrown the entire nervous system into chaos. This is his theory, and he presents it with the quiet confidence of a man who believes he has solved the puzzle. To him, this small hemorrhage is the answer, a tangible physical cause for the king's sudden and violent collapse. It's a finding that is both a testament to his own genius and a product of his limited tools. He can see a hemorrhage, but he cannot know what caused it, or if it was even the primary cause of death. It's a quirky tidbit of this particular autopsy that the location of this supposed hemorrhage was of great importance to Willis. He believed that a bleed at the base of the brain, in the area he had so brilliantly charted, would have had a profound and immediate impact on the body's ability to function. It was a perfect, self-fulfilling prophecy. He had a theory, he had a discovery, and now he had a diagnosis. The other physicians, seemingly relieved to have a definitive answer, nodded in agreement. The official story was now complete. The king, a man of strong passions and a full-blooded temperament, had succumbed not to poison, but to a natural if sudden failure of the brain, a small bleed that had been lying in wait. This finding would be included in the official report, and it would be the accepted cause of death for centuries. But even with this seemingly definitive discovery, there is still room for doubt, a small whisper of dissent in the room. A different physician, a man who had been observing the body with a more sceptical eye, quietly points out that the discoloration could be a post-mortem artifact, a natural result of the body's decomposition, and not a genuine hemorrhage. He suggests that the king's fits could have been caused by a different, unseen condition, perhaps a seizure disorder that had nothing to do with a physical bleed. But his voice is lost in the quiet excitement of Willis's discovery. The story is too good, too neat to be questioned. Historians still argue whether Willis's finding was a genuine discovery or a convenient piece of evidence that perfectly fit his pre-existing theories and provided a much-needed explanation for the royal death. It's an open, scholarly debate that goes to the heart of how we interpret historical medical records. As the final observations of the brain are recorded, you realise that the autopsy is almost over. The king's body has been a canvas for the physicians' theories, a physical manifestation of their beliefs about the body and its humours. They have found a crudity in the stomach, an enlarged liver, and now a small hemorrhage in the brain. Each finding on its own is inconclusive, but when woven together, they create a narrative of a natural death, one that absolves the doctors of any blame and puts an end to the growing rumours of poison. It's a masterpiece of historical spin, a diagnosis born not just of observation, but of necessity. The physicians pack up their tools, their work complete. The king's body, now violated in the name of science, lies still on the table. The next stage of this historical drama is about to begin. The preparation of the body for public viewing, a ritual that will be just as strange and politically charged as the autopsy itself. They have looked inside the king, and they have found what they were looking for. The question is, was it the truth, or was it just the most convenient answer they could find? And as the doors to the bedchamber swing open, letting in a new wave of courtiers and servants, you know that the final verdict on what they really found inside Charles II's body is still very much an open question, one that will be debated for centuries to come. With the official post-mortem complete, the frantic energy that once filled the king's chamber gives way to a new, more sinister current, the cold dread of suspicion. You've witnessed the doctors find a tidy, if questionable, medical explanation for the king's death. But for a court steeped in paranoia and political intrigue, a simple hemorrhage just doesn't feel right. Whispers begin to circulate, first as faint, almost inaudible murmurs, then growing in volume and intensity until they fill every corner of the palace. The word on everyone's lips is poison. A mainstream historical fact is that in 17th century Europe, the fear of poison was a very real and constant concern, especially within the confines of royal courts. It was the preferred weapon of political rivals, a subtle and almost undetectable way to remove an opponent, and Charles II's sudden, violent death fit the profile perfectly. You can practically feel the tension in the room as courtiers and privy councillors are allowed back into the chamber. They look at the king's still, pale body not with grief, but with suspicion. They are not thinking of humours and hemorrhages. They are thinking of a hidden enemy, a well-placed assassin who used an invisible weapon. The new king, James II, is particularly susceptible to these fears. He's a man who's already been at the centre of several political storms, and he knows that his brother's death, no matter how officially explained, will be used by his enemies as a tool of rebellion. He needs to know the truth, not just for his own peace of mind, but for the stability of his reign. The physicians, who have just presented a unified front of medical certainty, now find themselves on the defensive. Their findings, so recently a source of relief, are now being questioned. One of the more vocal courtiers, a man with a sharp nose and even sharper tongue, points out the inconsistencies in their report. They say he died of a hemorrhage, he says, his voice a low hiss, but his fits were violent, like a man struggling against a great torment, not like a man slowly fading from a small bleed. His words strike a chord with the others. The doctor's diagnosis, while medically plausible to them, doesn't fit the vivid theatrical reality of the king's final hours. This is where the rumours of poisoning begin to take on a life of their own. They are not just wild speculation. They are born of a rational fear and a keen political insight. A quirky tidbit of this time is that the art of poisoning had become so refined that it was almost impossible to detect. Poisons could be slow-acting, building up in the body over weeks or months, or they could be disguised as harmless medicines or food. There were even rumours of invisible poisons, substances that could be administered through touch, or even through the air itself. It was an age of paranoia, and Charles II's death was a perfect canvas for a nation's darkest fears. The physicians, in their own defence, begin to talk more forcefully about what they didn't find. They didn't find any significant corrosion in the stomach. They didn't find any of the telltale signs of a quick-acting, powerful poison. They argue that if the king had been poisoned, the evidence would have been more obvious, more dramatic. But their arguments are met with sceptical stares. The courtiers in turn argue that a clever poisoner would have used a slow-acting poison, one that would mimic the symptoms of a natural illness. They point to the fact that Charles's health had been in decline for some time, a fact that could be interpreted as a slow-acting poison taking its toll. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians were truly convinced of a natural cause of death, or if their public pronouncements were a political necessity, a way to quell the widespread fear and prevent a new king's reign from starting with a civil war. The poison panic wasn't just a palace phenomenon, it extended to the streets of London. The common people who loved their merry monarch were devastated by his death, and were quick to believe that it was the result of a Jesuit plot. James II, a Catholic, was deeply unpopular, and the fear was that he had orchestrated his brother's death to seize the throne. This popular narrative, while not supported by any hard evidence, was powerful and pervasive. The fear of a Catholic conspiracy was a constant undercurrent in English politics at the time, and Charles II's death was the perfect storm to bring it to the surface. You can practically hear the rumours spreading through the taverns and coffee houses of London, each one more outlandish than the last, all pointing to a grand conspiracy to murder the king. As you stand in the now empty bedchamber, the king's body having been moved to a different room for preparation, you realise that the search for the truth is far from over. The doctors may have closed the book on their medical inquiry, but the court and the country are just beginning theirs. The narrative of what really happened inside Charles II's body is no longer a medical one. It's a political one. The question is no longer what killed the king, but who killed the king? And the answer, whatever it may be, will be forever shrouded in a fog of fear, suspicion, and royal paranoia. The stage is set for the next part of this story, one that will delve deeper into the specific accusations of poisoning. We will look at the potential suspects, the rumoured methods, and the strange, often contradictory evidence that was used to either prove or disprove the claims. The doctor's work is done, but the detective's work is just beginning, and you, the silent observer, will be there to see it all. The ghost of Charles II's death will continue to haunt the halls of Whitehall Palace, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most compelling stories are not the ones that are told in the official records, but the ones that are whispered in the dark. The whispers of poison, once confined to the private chambers of the palace, now swirl like a fog throughout London, taking on a new and terrifying specificity. You're no longer just hearing vague accusations. You're hearing about a specific poison, a specific method, and a specific group of suspects. The most common and enduring of these rumours points to arsenic, a substance that was both readily available and notoriously difficult to detect with the medical methods of the 17th century. It's a mainstream historical fact that arsenic was a common poison of choice for assassins, often referred to as the inheritance powder because of its use in dispatching inconvenient relatives. Its symptoms, abdominal pain, vomiting and convulsions, could easily be mistaken for a variety of natural ailments, making it the perfect weapon for a subtle and cunning killer. The paranoia grows as people begin to connect Charles II's final, violent convulsions with the known symptoms of arsenic poisoning. They argue that his fits were not a result of a small hemorrhage, as the doctors claimed, but were the violent final throes of a man whose body was being systematically destroyed by a deadly substance. The fact that the official autopsy did not find any of the telltale signs of poisoning, such as corrosion of the stomach lining, is dismissed by the conspiratorial-minded as evidence of a very clever plot. They argue that a slow-acting form of arsenic would not have left such obvious marks. It's a classic case of historical confirmation bias. Those who wanted to believe the king was poisoned found a way to interpret the evidence to support their theory. The accusations, however, weren't just aimed at some faceless enemy. They were aimed at a specific group, the Catholics, and in particular the Jesuits. A quirky tidbit of this time is that the Jesuits had a reputation, whether deserved or not, for being masters of intrigue and deception. The fear of a Catholic plot to seize the English throne was a constant undercurrent in Protestant England, and James II's Catholicism made this fear all the more potent. The theory went that the Jesuits, seeing their opportunity, had poisoned Charles to get his Catholic brother on the throne. This was not a fringe theory. It was a widely held belief among the Protestant populace. They believed that Charles, though a Protestant in public, was a secret sympathiser with Catholicism, and that his death was the final step in a grand Catholic conspiracy. The methods of poisoning, according to the whispers, were as creative as they were deadly. Some believed that the poison was administered in the king's food or wine. Others argued that it was in the pulvis humani crani, the powdered human skull the doctors had given him, which they believed was not a medicine but a subtle poison in disguise. Still others argued that it was in his snuff or his perfume, a slow-acting toxin that would build up over time. The lack of a clear single suspect and a clear single method only fueled the fire of paranoia. It allowed everyone to create their own version of the story, each one more terrifying than the last. But the most bizarre accusation, one that shows the sheer depth of the paranoia, was that the poison was administered by the king's own mistress, Louise de Kerouaille, the Duchess of Portsmouth. A Frenchwoman and a Catholic, she was an easy target for suspicion. A quirky tidbit here is that her bedroom, which was adjacent to the king's, was rumoured to be the staging ground for the poisoning. She was accused of using her influence to control the king's food and wine, and of being a secret agent of the French and the Pope. There was, of course, no evidence to support these claims, but in an age of fear and suspicion, no evidence was often seen as proof of a well-executed plot. The doctors, who had just spent the last few hours performing a meticulous autopsy, were now being publicly questioned about their findings. Their careful notes about the lack of corrosion in the stomach were dismissed. Their theories about humours and hemorrhages were mocked. The court and the country had a new diagnosis: murder. And this new diagnosis had to be dealt with. The new king, James II, had a difficult choice to make. He could either order a new, more thorough investigation, which would only add to the public panic, or he could double down on the physician's original findings, a choice that would leave him open to accusations of a cover-up. He chose the latter, a sign of just how politically fraught the situation had become. Historians still argue whether the poison panic was a genuine fear of assassination or a political tool used by the Protestant faction to demonise the new Catholic king. It's an open scholarly debate that highlights the fragility of historical narratives. Was Charles II a victim of a clever plot, or was he a victim of his own unhealthy lifestyle and the primitive medical practices of his time? We will never know for sure, but the fact that the question still lingers shows the power of a good conspiracy theory. The royal court, in a desperate attempt to restore a sense of normalcy and to quell the growing public unrest, now turns its attention to the final rituals of a royal death. The king's body, now officially dead and autopsied, must be prepared for its public viewing and its final burial. The atmosphere in the palace has gone from one of frantic medical drama to one of quiet, respectful ritual, but the undercurrent of suspicion and paranoia is still very much present. The embalmers, the coffin makers, and the mourning courtiers are all just a part of a macabre theatre, a performance designed to show that everything is normal, even when it is not. You watch as the king's body is moved from the autopsy table and taken to another chamber. The work of the physicians is done. The work of the embalmers and the conspirators is just beginning. The final act of Charles II's life is not a medical one, it is a political one. And the search for what was really inside his body is now over, replaced by a search for what was really in the hearts and minds of the people who surrounded him. With the medical and political battles over his body momentarily concluded, the king's remains are now subjected to the solemn and at times bizarre rituals of a royal lying-in state. You're no longer in the tense, sterile environment of the autopsy chamber, but in a grand, sombre room where the air is thick with the scent of beeswax and cypress. The body, having been moved from the dissection table, is now being prepared for public viewing. This is not just a funeral rite, it is a political act, a public performance designed to project an image of stability and continuity in a time of profound uncertainty. A mainstream historical fact is that a royal lying in state was a long and elaborate affair, a tradition that stretched back centuries. It was a chance for the public to pay their final respects to their monarch, and for the new king, James II, to solidify his claim to the throne. You watch as a team of specialists, the royal embalmers and undertakers, move with practiced solemnity. They are not doctors, but artisans of death, their skills passed down through generations. Their task is to preserve the king's body, to make it appear as if he is merely sleeping, so that he can be viewed by the public for several days. This is a crucial part of the process, as it is a way to quell the rumours of poison and conspiracy. A body that looks peaceful and serene, they hope, will be harder to imagine as a victim of a violent crime. The king is dressed in his finest robes, a white satin gown embroidered with gold thread. A lace cap is placed on his head, and his hands are gently crossed over his chest. He's laid out on a magnificent bed of state, a catafalque draped in black velvet and adorned with the royal crest. The doors to the chamber are opened, and the public begins to file in, a long, slow river of people from all walks of life. They are there to mourn their merry monarch, a king who, despite his flaws, was generally well liked. You watch their faces, a mixture of genuine grief, morbid curiosity and quiet suspicion. The atmosphere is heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. They are looking at the king's body, but they are also looking for a sign, any sign that their fears of poison and treachery are justified. A quirky tidbit of this particular lying-in state is that the public was allowed to touch the king's body, a tradition that was believed to have a healing power, a kind of last posthumous touch of the king's hand. You wince as you watch a woman gently touch the king's hand, a look of reverence on her face. It's a reminder of a time when the monarchy was seen as a divine institution, its power and charisma extending even beyond the grave. But the king's body is not the only thing on display. A wax effigy, a life-sized model of the king, is also prepared. This is a crucial part of the spectacle, as the actual body will eventually be sealed in its coffin. The effigy, dressed in the king's clothes and adorned with his jewels, will be used in the funeral procession. It's a kind of doppelganger, a symbolic representation of the king that will continue to exist even after his body is laid to rest. Historians still argue whether the use of the effigy was a genuine religious and symbolic ritual, or a practical necessity, a way to ensure that a royal figure could be properly honoured in a long public procession without the gruesome reality of a decomposing body. It's a fascinating question that speaks to the dual nature of these rituals, part genuine mourning, part political theatre. As the days of the lying in state wear on, the air in the chamber becomes heavier, the scent of the embalming spices mingling with the perfume of the mourners. The public's gaze is relentless, their eyes searching for a flaw, a sign of foul play, a confirmation of their worst fears. The new king, James II, makes a point of visiting the lying in state, a public show of respect for his brother and a silent challenge to his detractors. He stands before the catafalque, his face a mask of grief. But you can feel the tension radiating from him. He is a man under pressure, a new king whose reign has begun with a death and a cloud of suspicion. The preparation of the body is not just about making it presentable for public viewing. It's also about a series of complex and, to our modern eyes, strange rituals. The king's heart and other internal organs are removed and placed in separate containers. This is a practice that dates back to the medieval period, a quirky tidbit that shows how these ancient traditions lingered on. The heart, in particular, was often considered to be the seat of the soul and was given a separate, often more sacred burial. The embalmers, with their specialised knowledge, would have taken great care in this process, a part of the ritual that would have been done in private, away from the public gaze. The royal lying in state is a powerful reminder that a king's death is never a private affair. It is a public spectacle, a moment of profound political and social significance. The king's body, which was so recently a battleground for doctors and their theories, is now a stage for a nation's grief and a nation's fear. And you, the silent observer, are there to see it all. The crowds will eventually disperse, the doors will be closed, and the king's body will be sealed in its coffin, but the questions and the rumours will live on. The final act of this macabre play has yet to be performed, and the story of what was really found inside Charles II's body is still being written. The solemnity of the lying in state gives way to the secretive, hushed world of the embalmer's room. You're no longer in a grand public space, but a small, unassuming chamber, tucked away in the labyrinthine corridors of the palace. The king's body, having been viewed by the public, is now in the hands of a small, dedicated team of specialists. Their job is to prepare the body for its final journey, and to ensure its preservation, a task that, in the 17th century, was a strange and often macabre blend of art and rudimentary science. A mainstream historical fact is that embalming was a highly developed skill, but the techniques were vastly different from those of today. They were not focused on perfect preservation, but on preventing immediate decay and making the body presentable for the funeral procession. You watch the team of embalmers, their faces grim and serious, as they go about their work. They are not doctors, but a class of specialised artisans who hold a unique and privileged position in the royal household. They begin by carefully removing the internal organs that were not examined during the autopsy. This is a crucial step, as the organs, particularly those in the abdomen, are the first to decompose. A quirky tidbit of this particular embalming is that the organs were not simply discarded. They were placed in special leaden urns, each one sealed with the royal crest. This was a long-standing tradition, a way to ensure that every part of the king's body was treated with the proper respect. These urns would be buried separately, a sign of the king's sacred and indivisible nature. The embalmers then turn their attention to the body itself. They use a variety of spices, resins and oils to preserve the skin and tissue. The air in the room is thick with the scent of myrrh, frankincense, and various other fragrant spices. They gently massage the king's skin with a mixture of oils, a process that is both a preservative and a final, tender act of care. They then pack the cavities of the body with these fragrant spices, a process that is designed to absorb moisture and slow down the process of decay. It's a messy but methodical business. They work in a silent, almost reverential state. The body to them is not just a body. It is the vessel of a king, a sacred object that must be treated with the utmost care. But the most macabre, and perhaps most interesting, part of the process is the removal and preservation of the king's heart. You remember that this was a tradition that dated back to the medieval period. The heart in their worldview was the seat of courage, of emotion, and of the soul. It was a part of the king that was considered too special to be buried with the rest of his body. It was given a separate burial, often in a different and more prominent location. You watch as one of the embalmers, a man with a steady hand, carefully removes the heart. He places it in a small ornate silver casket, a reliquary for the king's most vital organ. This is a part of the ritual that is steeped in superstition and ancient belief. They are not just preserving a body, they are preserving a symbol. The embalmers then turn their attention to the outside of the body. They use a mixture of waxes and powders to create a lifelike complexion, to fill in the hollows and lines that death has left behind. They are creating a mask, a peaceful and serene face that will be the last image of the king that many people will ever see. It's a powerful and at times unnerving process. They are transforming a corpse back into a king. The final step is to dress the body in its burial clothes, a lavish suit of black velvet, a symbol of mourning and dignity. The king is then placed in his coffin, a magnificent lead-lined affair that is designed to be both a protective shell and a symbol of his royal status. The embalmer's room is a place of profound contradiction. It is a place of death, but also a place of meticulous care and craftsmanship. It is a place of science, but also a place of ancient tradition and superstition. Historians still argue whether the embalming process was a genuine attempt at preservation, or a symbolic ritual, a way to honour the king's sacred status. It's an open scholarly debate that goes to the heart of how we interpret these ancient funeral rites. Were they practical, or were they purely symbolic? In the case of Charles II, it was likely a bit of both. They were using the best available techniques to preserve the body, but they were also doing it in a way that was steeped in centuries of tradition. As the lid of the coffin is finally sealed, you realise that the story of what was found inside Charles II's body is now truly over. The doctor's autopsy provided a flawed but official narrative. The whispers of poison provided a dramatic but unproven counter-narrative, and the embalmer's work provided a final physical closure, a way to put the king's body, if not the questions surrounding his death, to rest. The body is now a sealed object, a history that is no longer open to interpretation. It is now ready for its final journey, a grand funeral procession that will be a final, public performance of the king's power, and a final, public expression of a nation's grief. The atmosphere outside the embalmer's room is a mix of hushed anticipation and nervous energy. The palace is preparing for the funeral, a spectacle of pomp and ceremony that will be a stark contrast to the quiet, intimate work of the embalmers. You know that the story of Charles II's body is not yet complete. The journey of his heart, the funeral procession, and the final resting place will all add new layers to this complex and fascinating historical moment. But for now, the body itself is a closed book. The mysteries it held are now sealed, to be pondered and debated for centuries to come. The final act of the embalming ritual is a strange and poignant one, the separate journey of the king's heart. You watch from a distance as a small, solemn procession makes its way through the quiet, torchlit corridors of the palace. It is not the grand, public spectacle of a funeral, but a private, almost mystical rite. The heart, you remember, was placed in a small ornate silver casket. It is now being carried by a high-ranking courtier, his face a mask of solemn reverence. He is flanked by 2 guards, their pikes gleaming in the flickering light. This is the heart's journey to its final resting place, a tradition that is both a mainstream historical fact and a quirky tidbit of royal history. The practice of separating the heart from the body and giving it a different burial was a common one among medieval royalty. The heart, in their worldview, was not just an organ, it was the seat of the soul, the core of a person's being. By giving it a separate burial, they were honouring the king's most vital and spiritual part. It was also a way to create a second, smaller monument to the king, a kind of secondary pilgrimage site where people could come to pray and remember him. The heart, in this sense, was a symbol of the king's enduring love for his country and his people. It's a powerful, and deeply emotional ritual. You follow the small procession as it makes its way to the Chapel Royal at St James's Palace. This is not the grand Westminster Abbey, but a more intimate and in some ways more sacred space. The chapel is quiet, the air thick with the smell of old incense and ancient stone. The casket containing the king's heart is placed on the altar, and a short private service is held. The words are of his time, full of references to the king's divine right and his sacred duty. They are not just mourning a man, they are mourning a symbol, a divinely appointed leader whose heart, they believe, will forever be a part of the nation he ruled. But even this private, intimate ritual is not free from the political tensions that surrounded the king's death. Remember the poison panic? The fact that the heart was removed and placed in a separate casket could have been seen as a way to preserve a key piece of evidence. If the king had been poisoned, and the poison was still in his system, a later, more advanced analysis of the heart could have confirmed it. This is, of course, a speculative thought, but it's one that would have run through the minds of many at the time. The act of separating the heart was both a religious ritual and a kind of macabre scientific experiment. The journey of the heart is a powerful symbol of the king's life and death. He was a man who, despite his flaws, was seen as the heart of his nation. His life was a public spectacle, and his death was a moment of profound national anxiety. The heart's journey is a microcosm of that. It is a private, sacred act, but one that is imbued with public meaning. It is a journey that is both personal and political, and as you watch the casket being placed in a small, unassuming crypt beneath the chapel, you realise that the story of Charles II is not just a story of one man, but a story of a nation. Historians still argue whether the separate burial of the heart was a genuine religious and symbolic ritual, or a political necessity. It's an open, scholarly debate that goes to the heart of how we interpret these ancient traditions. Was it done out of genuine reverence for the king's sacred status, or was it a way to create a convenient and politically useful secondary monument? The answer is likely a bit of both. The ritual was ancient and deeply felt, but it was also a powerful tool of political propaganda. The main body of the king, meanwhile, is now in its lead-lined coffin, waiting for the public procession. The heart's journey is over, but the body's is just beginning. The funeral procession will be a final grand spectacle, a last public performance of the king's power, and a last public expression of a nation's grief. It will be a stark contrast to the quiet, intimate journey of the heart. The body, in its magnificent coffin, will be a symbol of power and authority, while the heart, in its humble crypt, will be a symbol of love and spirituality. The story of what they really found inside Charles II's body is now a story of two parts: the physical body, which has been opened, examined and sealed, and the spiritual heart, which has been removed, revered, and given a separate burial. The doctors, the embalmers, the courtiers, and the public have all had their say. The physical evidence has been interpreted, the rumours have been whispered, and the rituals have been performed. But the final chapter of this story is not yet written. The funeral procession and the final burial will be a final public act that will, for a time, put an end to the questions and the rumours. But you know that the questions will never truly go away. They will linger, like a ghost, in the halls of the palace and in the history books, a testament to the fact that a king's death is never a simple thing. The journey of the king's heart, a private, mystical affair, is a stark contrast to the grandeur and public spectacle that now unfolds. You're no longer in the hushed quiet of a chapel, but standing on the cold, cobbled streets of London, watching a procession of unprecedented scale and solemnity. The air is cold, but the crowds are immense, a sea of sombre faces lining the streets from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey. This is the king's final journey, the funeral procession of Charles II, and it is a powerful performance of statecraft and mourning. A mainstream historical fact is that royal funerals were not just about burying the dead. They were about affirming the authority of the new monarch and the continuity of the kingdom. This procession, in particular, was designed to be a clear and unambiguous statement that despite the rumours and the fears, the monarchy was stable and the transition of power was peaceful. The procession is a masterpiece of symbolic choreography. You watch as it begins, led by a detachment of foot soldiers, their pikes held high, their faces grim. They are followed by a long line of mourners, from the lowliest servants of the royal household to the highest-ranking nobles of the land. Each group is carefully arranged in order of precedence, a visible representation of the social and political hierarchy of the kingdom. The mourners are all dressed in black, their faces a mix of genuine grief and performed solemnity. You can almost feel the weight of their sorrow, or at least the weight of their expectations. The air is filled with the mournful sound of drums and the slow tolling of bells from 100 churches. At the centre of it all is the king's coffin, a magnificent affair draped in black velvet and adorned with the royal crest. It is carried on a specially built funeral carriage, a kind of macabre float pulled by a team of black-plumed horses. The carriage is surrounded by a guard of honour, and behind it, a long train of grieving courtiers and family members. It is a powerful and at times overwhelming spectacle. You realise that this is the final public act of Charles II's life, and it is a performance that is meant to be unforgettable. The king in death is still a symbol of power and authority, but the most striking and perhaps most unusual part of the procession is the wax effigy. A quirky tidbit of this particular funeral is that the king's actual coffin, while present, was not the main visual focus. Instead, a life-sized wax figure of the king, dressed in his finest robes and adorned with his crown and sceptre, was carried on a separate carriage. This effigy was a kind of stand-in for the king, a powerful symbol of his continued presence even in death. It was a tradition that dated back centuries, a way to ensure that a royal figure could be properly honoured in a long public procession without the gruesome reality of a decomposing body. The effigy's face, a placid mask of the king, stares out at the crowd, a silent and unchanging symbol of a monarch who is now gone. The procession winds its way through the streets of London, past the cheering and weeping crowds. The journey is long and slow, a deliberate performance of grief and respect. As it nears Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere becomes even more solemn. The Abbey, with its ancient stone walls and towering spires, is the final destination, the place where kings and queens have been laid to rest for centuries. It is a place of profound historical and religious significance, and the king's arrival there is the final symbolic act of his life. The doors of the Abbey swing open, and the procession slowly makes its way inside, the sounds of the crowd fading as they enter a world of hushed reverence and ancient ritual. Inside the Abbey, the spectacle continues. The coffin and the effigy are placed in the centre of the nave, and a long, solemn funeral service is held. The words are of his time, full of praise for the king and prayers for the future of the kingdom. The new king, James II, is there, his face a mask of solemn grief, a public performance that is meant to reassure a nation that the transition of power is complete and peaceful. Historians still argue whether the use of the effigy was a genuine religious and symbolic ritual or a practical necessity, a way to ensure that a royal figure could be properly honoured in a long public procession without the gruesome reality of a decomposing body. It's a fascinating question that speaks to the dual nature of these rituals, part genuine mourning, part political theatre. As the funeral service concludes, the king's body is taken to the royal vault, a small dark crypt beneath the abbey. The lead-lined coffin is lowered into its final resting place, a space that is already filled with the remains of other monarchs. The doors to the vault are sealed, and the king's body, the physical shell that was so recently a battleground for doctors and their theories, is finally at rest. The procession and the funeral are over, but the story is not. The questions surrounding his death will linger, a ghost that will haunt the history books for centuries to come. The final act of this macabre play has now been performed, but the final verdict is still very much in doubt. The solemnity of the funeral has faded into history, and the king's body, sealed in its lead coffin, now lies in the silent, perpetual darkness of the royal vault. But the story of what was found inside Charles II's body doesn't end with his burial. The narrative, like a ghost, reappears centuries later, when the king's skeletal remains are revisited by new eyes, armed with new knowledge. This is where the story shifts from the macabre theatre of the 17th century to the cold, clinical world of modern historical and forensic science. You're no longer a silent witness to an autopsy. You are a student of history, examining the reports and discoveries that would be made long after the king's bones had turned to dust. A mainstream historical fact is that royal tombs, including that of Charles II, have been opened and examined at various points in history, often for historical research or for restoration purposes. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as the science of anatomy and pathology advanced, These examinations became more than just a matter of identifying the remains. They became an opportunity to re-examine the historical records with a new and more critical eye. The skeletal remains of Charles II, in particular, were of great interest to historians and scientists who were sceptical of the 17th century physician's diagnosis. They wanted to know if the bones could tell a different story, one that was not coloured by the political and medical biases of the time. A quirky tidbit of these later examinations is that the skull, the very object that had been opened and examined by Dr. Willis, was a source of particular fascination. The 17th century doctors, you remember, had described a small hemorrhage at the base of the brain, a finding that they believed was the cause of death. But with the benefit of hindsight and modern medical knowledge, later scholars began to question this finding. They pointed out that a small hemorrhage, on its own, would not have caused the violent, sustained convulsions that Charles suffered from. They argued that the discoloration Willis had seen could have been a post-mortem artefact, a natural result of the body's decomposition. The skull itself, while showing the marks of the autopsy, offered no further clues to the cause of death. The bones, in this sense, were a silent witness to a historical lie, a physical testament to a diagnosis that was more a product of political necessity than of genuine scientific inquiry. But the most interesting discoveries came not from the skull, but from the rest of the skeleton. The later examiners looked for signs of long-term illness, for clues to the king's notoriously unhealthy lifestyle. They were no longer looking for a sudden, dramatic cause of death, but for the slow, grinding effects of years of gluttony and indulgence. They examined the bones of the hands and feet, looking for signs of gout, a disease that, you remember, was a common affliction of the king, and what they found was a powerful confirmation of the historical record. The bones showed clear signs of chronic gout, a condition that would have caused the king immense pain and suffering in his later years. This was not a sudden illness, but a long-term one, a condition that could have been a contributing factor to his overall poor health. But the most tantalizing discovery of all came from the examination of the spine and other key joints. The skeletal remains showed signs of advanced arthritis, a condition that, when combined with the gout, would have made the king's last years a period of significant discomfort. It's a detail that, while not directly related to his death, adds a new and more poignant layer to his story. He was not just the merry monarch, a man of wit and pleasure. He was also a man in pain, a king whose body was slowly failing him. This is a story that the 17th century doctors, with their focus on humours and sudden illness, would have completely missed. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound historical truths are found not in the dramatic accounts of a king's final hours, but in the quiet, patient examination of his bones. Historians still argue whether the later examinations of Charles II's skeletal remains are definitive proof of a natural cause of death. It's an open, scholarly debate that goes to the heart of how we interpret historical evidence. Can we, with our modern knowledge, truly understand the limitations and biases of the past? Can we, with our advanced forensic tools, truly solve a mystery that is centuries old? The bones, in the end, are just a part of the puzzle. They provide us with physical evidence, but they cannot tell us the full story. They cannot tell us what was in the minds of the people who surrounded the king, or what fears and anxieties were swirling through the court. They can only tell us about the slow, silent reality of a body in decline, a story that is both a confirmation of the past and a challenge to it. The story of what was really found inside Charles II's body is a story of layers. It begins with the 17th century autopsy, a macabre performance of flawed science and political necessity. It then moves to the whispers of poison, a powerful narrative of fear and paranoia, and it finally concludes with the modern examination of the skeletal remains, a quiet, patient search for the truth that lies beneath all the pomp and ceremony. The bones, in the end, have the final word. They tell a story of a man, not just a king, a story of a body that, like all bodies, was a product of its time and a victim of its own humanity. The final verdict on his death, however, is still very much in doubt. The bones, a silent testament to a life of indulgence, have offered their truth, a story of gout and arthritis that the 17th century physicians, with their focus on sudden illness, completely missed. But the story of what really happened inside Charles II's body doesn't end there. It's time to bring the full weight of modern forensics and medical science to bear on the historical accounts. You're no longer just a spectator to history. You're a medical detective, sifting through centuries-old records with a new and more critical eye. This is where we step back from the macabre theatre and the solemn rituals and try to construct a final, coherent diagnosis, one that separates fact from the fog of historical misinformation. A mainstream historical fact is that the symptoms described by the 17th century doctors, the sudden violent convulsions, the loss of consciousness, the eventual coma, are highly suggestive of a modern diagnosis of a stroke or a cerebral hemorrhage. Dr. Willis, you remember, had described a small extravasation of blood at the base of the brain. While his diagnosis was limited by his tools and knowledge, his observation was remarkably accurate. We now know that a hemorrhagic stroke, a bleed in the brain, can cause exactly the kind of symptoms that Charles II suffered. It's a plausible, and in many ways, compelling, explanation for his sudden collapse. The small hemorrhage Willis saw could have been the result of a larger, more catastrophic event, one that was simply beyond his ability to fully comprehend. But the story is not that simple. We also have to consider the other symptoms, the ones that the 17th century doctors either dismissed or misinterpreted. Remember the conflicting accounts of the king's kidneys. Some reports, you recall, suggested they were in a bad state, while the official report was more vague. Modern medicine knows that a long-term untreated condition like gout can lead to kidney failure. This condition, known as uremia, can cause a build-up of toxins in the blood, which can in turn lead to a variety of neurological symptoms including convulsions and coma. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle, a quirky tidbit of modern medical forensics. The idea that the king's fits were not a result of a hemorrhage, but were a uremic seizure, a kind of seizure caused by kidney failure. So which is it? A stroke or a uremic seizure? This is where the open scholarly debate truly begins. Historians and medical professionals still argue about the most likely cause of death. Some argue that the violent nature of the fits is more consistent with a uremic seizure. They point to the fact that Charles II's gout, a well-documented condition, would have put him at high risk for kidney failure. They argue that the hemorrhage Willis saw was either a red herring, a post-mortem artifact, or a secondary event, a result of the extreme pressure placed on the king's body during the convulsions. They believe that the real story of what was found inside Charles II's body is a story of a slow, grinding decline. A body that was finally brought low not by a single catastrophic event, but by a long-term, chronic illness. Others, however, are not so convinced. They argue that while uremia is a plausible explanation, it doesn't fully account for the king's sudden collapse. They point to the fact that Charles II, while suffering from gout, was still a vibrant and active man in his final years. A person with advanced kidney failure would have been far more debilitated. They argue that a hemorrhagic stroke is a more immediate and dramatic cause of death, one that better fits the historical accounts of his sudden collapse. They also point to the fact that Dr. Willis, a pioneer of neuroanatomy, was a man who would have been uniquely qualified to spot hemorrhage, even with his limited tools. They believed that his observation, though incomplete, was a genuine one, and that the hemorrhage was the primary cause of death. The problem, of course, is that we will never know for sure. The historical records are incomplete, and the physical evidence, the king's body itself, is no longer available for a modern, full forensic analysis. We are left with a collection of clues, a medical puzzle that is missing a few key pieces. The story of what was really found inside Charles II's body is a story of historical interpretation, of a battle between competing narratives. It is a story that, in many ways, is more a reflection of our own understanding of medicine and history than it is a definitive answer to a centuries-old mystery. As you consider these two competing theories, you realise that the truth may be a combination of both. It's possible that Charles II, a man with a long-term debilitating case of gout and a famously unhealthy lifestyle, was a walking time bomb. His blood pressure, a direct result of his diet and his health, would have been dangerously high. The gout would have been slowly destroying his kidneys. The stress of his life, the constant political intrigue, would have been a constant strain on his body. It's possible that he suffered a uremic seizure, or a stroke, or a combination of both. The final event may have been the culmination of a long, slow decline, a body that was finally unable to cope with the pressures placed upon it. The final diagnosis of history, it seems, is not a simple one, but a complex tapestry of medical and historical facts, woven together with a healthy dose of speculation. The ghost of gout, a painful and often overlooked affliction, now looms large in our modern re-evaluation of Charles II's death. It's a condition that the 17th century physicians knew of, but its systemic and long-term effects were entirely beyond their comprehension. They saw the painful, swollen joints and diagnosed it as a simple imbalance of humours. We, however, with our modern understanding of pathology, see it as a potential key to the entire mystery. You're no longer just a spectator to history, but a forensic pathologist, tracing a single, consistent disease through the chaos of historical accounts and primitive medical records. A mainstream historical fact is that Charles II was a known sufferer of gout for many years. His father, Charles I, had also suffered from the condition, and it was a common affliction of royalty and the wealthy, whose diets were rich in red meat, organ meats, and alcohol, all things that contribute to the build-up of uric acid in the blood. The king's famously gluttonous appetite, which you remember from the autopsy, would have made his condition even worse. The doctors in their time would have treated his gout with a variety of strange and ineffective remedies, but they would never have connected the pain in his joints to the sudden collapse of his body. They would have seen them as two separate issues, one a chronic annoyance, the other a life-ending event. But we know better. A quirky tidbit of modern medical knowledge is that untreated gout can lead to a condition called gouty nephropathy, a form of kidney disease. The excess uric acid crystals, which cause the painful inflammation in the joints, can also accumulate in the kidneys, leading to damage and eventually kidney failure. This is where the story gets really interesting. Remember the conflicting accounts of the king's kidneys? The official report said they were in a reasonable state, while the private whispers suggested they were filled with stones. It's possible that both were, in a sense, right. The kidneys may not have shown the kind of dramatic immediate failure that a modern doctor would recognise as the primary cause of death, but they could have been slowly and silently failing for years. The stones that were whispered about could have been uric acid crystals, a clear sign of gouty nephropathy. This theory provides a compelling and elegant explanation for the king's final hours. It suggests that his fits were not a stroke or an isolated event, but were uremic convulsions, a result of his kidneys finally giving out. The build-up of toxins in his blood, which his failing kidneys could no longer filter, would have poisoned his brain, leading to the sudden and violent fits. This is a diagnosis that fits all the known facts. It explains the king's long-term health problems. It explains the conflicting reports of the kidneys. It explains the violent, sustained nature of his convulsions. It even provides a new perspective on Dr. Willis's small extravasation of blood. It's possible that the hemorrhage was a secondary event, a result of the extreme pressure placed on the king's body during the uremic convulsions. The theory of gout as the silent killer is a powerful and persuasive one. But, as with all historical mysteries, there is still room for doubt. Historians still argue whether the evidence for gouty nephropathy is strong enough to overturn the stroke theory. It's an open scholarly debate that goes to the heart of how we interpret historical medical data. The 17th century doctors, with their humoral theories, were not looking for kidney disease. They were looking for an imbalance of humours, and they would have interpreted any signs of kidney damage through that lens. Their records are, by our standards, incomplete and often contradictory. So while the evidence for gout is compelling, it is not by itself a slam dunk. The story of the ghost of the gout is a powerful reminder that history is not a static thing. It is a living, breathing narrative that is constantly being re-evaluated and reinterpreted with new knowledge and new tools. The king's body, which was so recently a sealed book, is now once again open to interpretation. The gout, a seemingly minor affliction, a painful annoyance in his life, may have been the very thing that killed him. It's a tragic and poetic irony, a reminder that sometimes the biggest killers are the ones we ignore. As you consider this new piece of the puzzle, you realise that the final diagnosis of Charles II is not a simple one. It is not just a stroke or a uremic seizure. It is a complex tapestry of a man's life and a man's death. It is a story of a long-term, debilitating illness that was ignored by a medical establishment that was focused on a different set of problems. It is a story of a body that, after years of indulgence, finally gave up. The final act of this macabre play is not a verdict, but a reconsideration. The ghost of the gout has now been given its voice, and it is a voice that speaks volumes about the life and death of a king. The final act of this historical mystery is not a simple verdict, but a composite picture, a tapestry woven from the threads of 17th century medical practice, the whispers of political intrigue, and the cold, hard facts of modern forensic science. You're no longer just a spectator to this story. You are the one tasked with assembling all the pieces into a single coherent narrative. We must now separate fact from the sensationalism of the era and arrive at a final, considered diagnosis of Charles II's health and the true cause of his death. A mainstream historical fact is that the official diagnosis of the 17th century physicians, a cerebral hemorrhage, was a plausible, if incomplete one. They saw a bleed in the brain, and they attributed the king's death to it. This was a diagnosis that was both medically defensible and politically convenient. It was a natural cause of death that absolved them of any blame for their failed treatments, and quieted the rumours of poison. But, as we've seen, this diagnosis was likely a product of their limited knowledge and their desperate need for a definitive answer. It was a diagnosis that was more a reflection of their worldview than it was a true and complete picture of the king's health. But we have more information now. We have the whispers of poison, which, while not supported by any hard evidence, reveal the widespread paranoia of the time. The fear of a Catholic conspiracy to murder the king was a very real thing, and it's a part of the historical narrative that cannot be ignored. The poison panic, while likely a case of mass hysteria, reveals the deep political and religious divisions that were simmering just beneath the surface of English society. It reminds us that a king's death is never a simple thing. It is a public and political event that can be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. And then we have the cold, hard facts of modern forensics. We have the skeletal remains, which showed clear signs of gout and arthritis, a long-term debilitating condition that would have been a significant factor in the king's overall health. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle, a quirky tidbit of modern science that completely reframes the historical narrative. It suggests that the king was not just a healthy man who was struck down by a sudden illness, but a man whose body was slowly failing him. This long-term decline, a story that was completely missed by the 17th century doctors, is a crucial part of his final diagnosis. So, what is the final verdict? The most likely explanation, the one that fits all the known facts, is not a simple one. It is a story of a man, Charles II, who was a walking time bomb. He was a man with a famously unhealthy lifestyle, a rich diet, and a love of wine. He suffered from a long-term, debilitating case of gout, a condition that was slowly and silently destroying his kidneys. The stress of his life, the constant political intrigue, would have contributed to a dangerously high blood pressure. All of these factors would have made him susceptible to a sudden, catastrophic event. The most likely cause of his final, violent convulsions was not an isolated event, but the culmination of this long, slow decline. It's possible that he suffered a uremic seizure, a kind of seizure caused by kidney failure. The build-up of toxins in his blood, which his failing kidneys could no longer filter, would have poisoned his brain, leading to the sudden and violent fits. It's also possible that he suffered a hemorrhagic stroke, a bleed in the brain that was a direct result of his dangerously high blood pressure. Or, and this is the most likely scenario, it was a combination of both. It's possible that the uremic convulsions were a precursor to the stroke, or that the stroke was a secondary event, a result of the extreme pressure placed on his body during the convulsions. The final diagnosis is not a single, neat answer, but a complex tapestry of medical and historical facts. It is a story of a man whose body, after years of indulgence and neglect, finally gave up. It is a story of a medical establishment that, with its limited knowledge, was trying its best to make sense of the incomprehensible. It is a story of a nation that, in a time of profound political and religious division, was desperate for an explanation, any explanation, for the sudden death of its king. Historians still argue about the exact cause of death, and it's an open scholarly debate that will likely never be fully resolved. The evidence is simply too incomplete. But the final picture, the one we are left with, is a far more compelling and human story than the one that was told in the official records. It is a story of a king, yes, but also a story of a man who, like all of us, was a product of his time and a victim of his own humanity. The final verdict is not a judgment, but a final, poignant acknowledgement of the complexities of life and death. The king's body, in the end, told a truth that was far more powerful than the lies of the doctors or the whispers of the courtiers. It told a truth about a life of excess, and a death that was both tragic and, in a strange way, inevitable. With the final composite diagnosis now in our grasp, the dramatic tale of Charles II's last days and the autopsy that followed begins to resolve into a more sober and compelling narrative. We've sifted through the layers of history, separating the medical theatre from the political paranoia. Now it's time to bring all the threads together into a single, cohesive story that respects both the knowledge of the past and the insights of the present. You are now the narrator, weaving a final, definitive account of what they really found inside the king's body, not just in terms of his physical remains, but in the broader context of his life and death. The story begins, not with the convulsions of February 2nd, 1685, but years earlier, with the gradual silent decline of a king's health. The man the people knew as the Merry Monarch, with his famously gluttonous appetite and his libertine lifestyle, was also a man in constant pain. The skeletal remains, a mainstream historical fact that was discovered centuries later, confirm this. They show clear and undeniable signs of chronic gout and advanced arthritis. This was not a sudden illness, but a long-term debilitating condition that would have caused the king immense suffering in his later years. It's a detail that adds a new and more human layer to the story. He was not just a king, he was a man in pain, a man whose body was slowly and inexorably failing him. This long-term decline is the key to understanding the king's final hours. The 17th century physicians, with their humoral theories, were looking for a sudden dramatic imbalance. But the truth, as we now know, was far more mundane and far more tragic. The gout, that seemingly minor affliction, was the silent killer. It was slowly destroying his kidneys, a process that would have been invisible to the doctors of his time. The official autopsy, you remember, was vague on the state of the kidneys, a detail that we now know was either a product of a political cover-up or simply a reflection of the fact that the doctors were looking for a different kind of pathology. The private whispers of gritty stones, a quirky tidbit of historical hearsay, were likely a reference to the uric acid crystals that are the hallmark of gouty nephropathy, a condition that the doctors would have had no way of diagnosing. The king's violent fits, the ones that the doctors so desperately tried to cure with crushed pearl and powdered human skull, were not a stroke or a simple hemorrhage. They were, in all likelihood, uremic convulsions, a result of his kidneys finally giving out. The toxins that his failing kidneys could no longer filter would have built up in his blood, poisoning his brain and causing the sudden violent seizures. The hemorrhage that Dr. Willis so proudly announced as the cause of death was in all likelihood a secondary event, a result of the extreme pressure placed on the king's body during the convulsions. It was a detail that was both a stroke of genius and a tragic misunderstanding. Willis, a pioneer of neuroanatomy, saw a bleed and attributed the death to it. He was right about the bleed, but he was wrong about its cause and its ultimate role in the king's death. This final diagnosis, a complex tapestry of gout, kidney disease and uremic convulsions, also provides a new perspective on the poison panic. The symptoms of uremia, vomiting, convulsions and eventual coma, are remarkably similar to the symptoms of slow-acting arsenic poisoning. The public, steeped in a culture of paranoia and suspicion, would have been right to suspect foul play. They saw a man die a violent and unnatural death, and they were looking for a plausible explanation. The doctors, with their primitive tools and their flawed theories, were unable to provide one. So the people created their own, a narrative of a Catholic plot to murder a king, a narrative that was both a reflection of their fears and a testament to the fact that they knew, deep down, that there was something profoundly wrong with the official story. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians were truly convinced of a natural cause of death, or if their public pronouncements were a political necessity. It's an open scholarly debate that goes to the heart of how we interpret historical medical records. But with our modern knowledge, the answer seems clear. They were not malicious, but they were limited. They were men of their time, and they were trying their best to make sense of an event that was in many ways beyond their comprehension. Their diagnosis of a cerebral hemorrhage was not a lie, but it was also not the full truth. The full truth, the one that we have now assembled, is a far more complex and poignant story. The final picture of Charles II's health is not a simple one. It is a story of a man whose life of excess, while celebrated by his people, was also slowly killing him. It is a story of a long-term debilitating illness that was ignored by a medical establishment that was focused on a different set of problems. It is a story of a sudden, violent death that was the culmination of a slow, silent decline. The king's body, in the end, told a truth that was far more powerful than the lies of the doctors or the whispers of the courtiers. It told a truth about a life of excess, and a death that was both tragic and, in a strange way, inevitable. The final chapter of this story is not a verdict, but a final, poignant acknowledgement of the complexities of life and death, and the power of history to reveal a truth that was hidden for centuries. You've stood in the king's final hours, watched the macabre theatre of his autopsy, and followed the whisper of suspicion through the palace corridors. We've brought the insights of modern medicine to bear on a 300-year-old mystery, piecing together a story that is far more nuanced than the one recorded in the official histories. Now, it's time to bring all of these threads to their final, quiet conclusion. This is the last chapter of our journey, a moment to reflect on the legacy of Charles II's death and the enduring power of a historical puzzle. The final verdict on what they really found inside Charles II's body is a tapestry of truth, woven from fact and informed speculation. The official diagnosis of a cerebral hemorrhage was, in a very limited sense, correct. Dr. Willis, a man of his time but also a pioneer, likely saw what he described. A mainstream historical fact is that hemorrhagic strokes can be caused by long-term, unmanaged high blood pressure, and it is a plausible immediate cause of death. But the modern diagnosis goes deeper, revealing the underlying causes that made such an event not just possible but probable. We know from the later examination of his remains that the king suffered from severe gout and arthritis. This wasn't just a minor pain in his joints, it was a systemic illness that was slowly, silently destroying his body. A quirky tidbit of this final analysis is that the gout, often seen as a comical affliction of the wealthy, was in fact the silent killer, a relentless force of nature that brought a king to his knees. This long-term, debilitating illness, a story that was completely missed by the doctors of the 17th century, is the key to understanding everything. The king's famously gluttonous diet and love of wine were not just a part of his personality. They were the fuel for his illness. The gout led to kidney damage, a condition that the doctors either didn't see or couldn't recognise. The whispers of gritty stones were, in all likelihood, an accurate if unscientific description of uric acid crystals in his kidneys. This kidney damage would have led to a build-up of toxins in his blood, and this uremia, we now know, can cause the very same violent convulsions that the king suffered from. It's a diagnosis that fits all the known facts. Reconciling the historical accounts with the insights of modern medicine, it's a testament to the power of new knowledge to illuminate old mysteries. So the final composite picture is this. Charles II, the Merry Monarch, was a man in decline. His body, after a lifetime of indulgence, was slowly giving out. The gout had destroyed his joints, and the relentless onslaught of uric acid had begun to damage his kidneys. The end came not from a sudden, isolated illness, but from the culmination of a long, slow decline. The convulsions were likely a uremic seizure, a result of his failing kidneys. The hemorrhage was either a secondary event, a result of the extreme pressure placed on his body during the fits, or a completely different but contributing factor. The doctors, limited by their knowledge, saw a bleed and attributed the death to it. They weren't lying, but they weren't telling the whole truth either. They were simply doing their best with the tools and theories they had. The whispers of poison, a powerful narrative of fear and paranoia, also find their place in this final diagnosis. The symptoms of uremia are so similar to the symptoms of slow-acting arsenic poisoning that it is no wonder the public and the court were so quick to believe in a plot. The doctors, in their failure to provide a complete and convincing diagnosis, left a vacuum that was quickly filled by fear and suspicion. The poison panic, while a case of mass hysteria, was also a powerful, and in a strange way, a justified critique of a medical establishment that was simply not up to the task. Historians still argue whether the royal physicians were truly convinced of a natural cause of death, or if their public pronouncements were a political necessity. It's an open scholarly debate that will likely never be resolved, but our modern understanding suggests that the truth was somewhere in the middle. They were men of science, but they were also men of their time, and they were trying to navigate a political and medical landscape that was fraught with peril. The story of what they really found inside Charles II's body is a story of layers, of a historical narrative that has been rewritten and reinterpreted over the centuries. It begins with a 17th century autopsy that was as much a political act as it was a medical one. It then moves to the whispers of a nation steeped in paranoia and fear, and it finally concludes with the cold, hard facts of modern forensic science. A patient, quiet search for the truth that lies beneath all the pomp and ceremony. The final verdict is not a single, neat answer, but a complex, human, and ultimately tragic story of a king whose body, in the end, betrayed him. Now, as the final chapter of our story comes to a close, and the lights of the palace fade into the mists of history, it's time for you to drift off. The story is over, but the questions linger, a testament to the fact that a king's life and his death are never a simple thing. This is the end of our journey tonight. The mystery of what they really found inside Charles II's body has been a long and winding road, but I hope you feel that we've arrived at a more complete and satisfying answer. The king's body, in the end, told a truth that was far more powerful than the lies of the doctors or the whispers of the courtiers. It told a truth about a life of excess, and a death that was both tragic and, in a strange way, inevitable. The final diagnosis is not a judgment, but a final, poignant acknowledgement of the complexities of life and death, and the power of history to reveal a truth that was hidden for centuries. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark corners of the past. The history we've explored tonight is full of strange and wonderful details, but for now, it's time to let them fade into the background. Let the final echoes of the palace and the silent truth of the king's bones settle in your mind. The sounds of our story are now just a gentle hum, and the images are soft and blurry at the edges. Close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and drift off to sleep. There will be other nights and other stories to explore, but for now, the journey is over. Let the calm wash over you.